Welcome back to CrimeWave Radio. Before you settle in for the night, let us know where you're listening from in the comments and what time you're watching this. If you're enjoying these chilling crimes, be sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's relax, turn down the lights, and dive into tonight's disturbing cases. Story 1, the Cleveland Kidnappings. On the 22nd of August 2002, the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, carried a sense of routine normalcy. Parents hurried their children off to school. Workers rushed to their morning shifts, and the hum of the city moved along without interruption. But somewhere in the heart of it all, a sinister force lurked. One that had already changed one young girl's life forever. That morning, 20-year-old Michelle Knight walked with purpose, but with an undeniable heaviness in her heart. Life had not been kind to her. She had spent years navigating a troubled home, trying to stay afloat despite the odds stacked against her. But this day was particularly important. She was due in court for a custody hearing, one that could determine whether she would regain custody of her young son, Joey. As she made her way through Cleveland streets, she could not have known that she was only moments away from vanishing into the shadows of a nightmare, one that would stretch on for more than a decade. Michelle's path led her through a familiar part of town, the working-class neighborhood of Tremont. It was there that she encountered a face she recognized. Ariel Castro, a middle-aged school bus driver, had always seemed friendly, a man well known in the neighborhood. He even had a daughter around Michelle's age. When Castro offered her a ride to the courthouse, she hesitated. Something about him felt off, but the desperation to reach her hearing, the hope of being reunited with her son, made her decision for her. She got in the car. Instead of driving toward the courthouse, Castro took an unexpected turn. Michelle's stomach tightened. She asked why they were going the wrong way. His response was casual. He just needed to stop by his house for a moment. The house on Seymour Avenue was nothing remarkable from the outside. A two-story home with peeling paint and a weathered appearance. It blended into the neighborhood like any other. But inside, it was something else entirely. As soon as Michelle stepped inside, she sensed something was horribly wrong. The windows were covered with makeshift barriers, thick layers of plastic and wooden boards. The air was thick with an unsettling staleness, and somewhere in the distance, a faint metallic clinking sound echoed from behind a closed door. Before she could react, she felt a sudden, crushing grip on her wrist. Panic surged through her, but she was no match for him. Castro overpowered her with ease, dragging her deeper into the house, down a narrow hallway, and into a small, dimly lit room. Then the door locked behind her, and Michelle Knight disappeared from the world. Nearly a year passed before the city of Cleveland would witness another disappearance. On April 21st, 2003, 16-year-old Amanda Berry was supposed to be celebrating. It was the day before her 17th birthday, and she had just finished her shift at Burger King, eager to get home and enjoy the milestone with her family. But she never made it. A concerned mother waited by the window, expecting to see her daughter's familiar silhouette walking up to their home. When Amanda failed to arrive, panic set in. The minutes stretched into hours. The hours bled into days, and as missing posters were plastered across Cleveland, Amanda's name joined Michelle's in the growing list of young women who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Like Michelle, Amanda had unknowingly stepped into the hands of Ariel Castro. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The disappearances sent shockwaves through the community. Families grieved, the police searched, and hope flickered in the face of mounting despair. Yet, behind the walls of 2207 Seymour Avenue, a monster operated undetected. Michelle Knight was no longer alone. Amanda Berry now shared her fate, held captive in the dark, windowless house that seemed to swallow every trace of their existence. And worse, Ariel Castro wasn't done. Gina DeJesus walked the familiar streets of Cleveland, completely unaware that she was being watched. 14 years old and full of life, She had spent the afternoon with her best friend, Arlene, who just so happened to be Ariel Castro's daughter. The two had planned to hang out longer, but Arlene's mother had said no, sending Gina on her way home alone. As she walked, a maroon vehicle pulled up beside her. The driver leaned out of the window with an easy, familiar smile. It was Ariel Castro. He asked Gina if she had seen Arlene. The question seemed strange. He was her father, after all. But Gina, trusting and polite, answered anyway. She told him that Arlene had gone home. Castro's smile didn't falter. He casually asked if she could help him find her. Maybe they could drive around together. Check the neighborhood. Gina hesitated. Something about it didn't sit right. But this was her best friend's father. She had been in his home before. Her own family knew him. The idea of danger didn't even seem like a possibility. She got in the car. Instead of driving through the neighborhood, Castro turned down Seymour Avenue, pulling into his driveway. He reassured her, saying he just needed to grab some money before they continued looking for Arlene. Again, something felt off, but Gina followed him inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. She would not leave for nearly a decade. Inside the house, Michelle Knight and Amanda Berry heard the sounds of struggle. They already knew what had happened. A new voice, a new victim. The nightmare was growing. Gina fought. But it was no use. She was only 14. Castro was bigger, stronger, and he had perfected his methods. He forced her into a room, trapping her with chains, the same fate as the others. Days passed, then weeks. Gina's family was frantic, unlike Michelle Knight, whose disappearance had barely been covered. Gina's case drew massive attention. News reports, missing posters, police searches. The city of Cleveland was looking for her, but they were looking in all the wrong places, just like Amanda, just like Michelle. Trapped in the suffocating darkness of Seymour Avenue, the three girls quickly learned the rules of survival. Castro was unpredictable. Some days he was eerily kind, offering food and small comforts. Other days he was merciless, inflicting pain both physical and psychological. He manipulated them, making them believe there was no escape. The house was a fortress, windows boarded, doors locked, chains heavy. They weren't just captives. They were his possessions. Years passed in a blur of torment. The outside world moved on. Families grieved. But inside that house, time stood still. Until one day, a tiny, unexpected light appeared in the darkness. Amanda Berry was pregnant. Amanda Berry sat in the dimly lit room, her body aching from months of captivity. But now, something else consumed her. Fear. She was pregnant. Ariel Castro had made sure of that. She knew what this meant. She had seen his cruelty firsthand. He had controlled them with an iron grip, rationing their food, punishing them for the smallest infractions. What would he do when he realized a child was growing inside her? But to her surprise, Castro reacted differently than she expected. He was almost pleased. In his twisted mind, this was a sign of power, of ownership. He allowed Amanda slightly better treatment, giving her more food, making sure she stayed strong. It was a sick kind of care, but care nonetheless. Months passed, and as Amanda's belly grew, so did the tension in the house. Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus watched in silence, knowing that anything that pleased Castro also had the potential to make things worse for them. By the time Amanda reached her final weeks of pregnancy, the air in the house was suffocating with an unspoken dread. Would Castro allow the baby to live? Or would she become another victim of his cruelty? On Christmas Eve of 2006, Amanda went into labor. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no sterile rooms. Just the filthy confines of Seymour Avenue and the presence of Michelle Knight, whom Castro forced to assist in the delivery. Michelle had no medical experience, no idea how to help, but she had no choice. Castro's demands were clear. If the baby didn't survive, neither would she. Amanda screamed through the excruciating pain. Her body weakened from years of captivity, malnutrition, and fear. Michelle did the best she could, following instinct, doing whatever it took to help bring the child into the world. The room was hot, the air thick, and the only sounds were Amanda's cries and Castro's sharp instructions. And then, finally, a baby's first breath. A girl. Amanda held her newborn daughter against her chest, tears slipping silently down her face. Jocelyn. She had chosen the name long ago, in the quiet moments when she still allowed herself to dream of a future. Castro stood over them, watching. A smirk curled at the edges of his lips. To him, this was his ultimate act of control, a child born in captivity, a symbol of his dominance over Amanda's life. In the days that followed, something changed. Jocelyn became a new kind of prisoner in the house on Seymour Avenue. But unlike Amanda, Michelle, and Gina, she was treated differently. Castro allowed her things he never allowed the others. Toys, books. Sometimes he even let Amanda watch cartoons with her. He took pride in Jocelyn, parading her around the house like a prize. But the horror remained. Years passed, and as Jocelyn grew, the house's dark secrets became harder to hide. She was a bright child, curious, always asking questions. She noticed that she and her mother never left the house. She noticed that doors were always locked, that certain rooms were off limits. Amanda did everything she could to shield her daughter from the nightmare they lived in. She told her stories, played pretend games, made life inside seem normal. But she knew the truth. They had to get out. As Jocelyn grew older, Castro became more careless. He was confident that the women had given up hope, that they were too afraid to ever try to escape. He stopped locking doors as tightly. He started leaving the house for longer periods. Amanda watched. She waited. She memorized his habits, looking for a crack in his control. And then, in the spring of 13, she saw her chance. One afternoon, as Castro left the house, he forgot to secure the main door properly. It was still locked, but it wasn't as secure as usual. Amanda noticed it immediately. Her heart pounded in her chest. Could this be it? She hesitated. Fear was paralyzing. What if it was a trap? But then she looked at Jocelyn, her daughter, now 6 years old, living in a world that wasn't real. If Amanda didn't take the chance now, why would she? She listened carefully. No sound of Castro's car returning. No heavy footsteps in the hall. She took Jocelyn's hand, slowly. She made her way to the front door. The first lock gave way. The second was loose. But then, the final door. It was locked, but not fully closed. There was a gap just enough to see through. Amanda's breath hitched. For the first time in years, she saw sunlight. The street outside looked so normal. People walked past, completely unaware that just behind this door, 3 women and a child were being held captive. She pushed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. She shoved harder. It was stuck. Panic rose in her throat. She started screaming. Help! Please, help me! Her voice was raw, desperate. She banged on the door, shouting as loud as she could. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, a man stopped on the sidewalk. He turned toward the house, confused. Amanda's fingers clawed at the opening. Help me! I'm Amanda Berry. Recognition flashed across his face. Amanda Berry. The girl who had disappeared 10 years ago. He hesitated for a second, then rushed forward. Hold on, he shouted, grabbing at the door. Together they pulled, yanking at the locked frame, trying to break it open. The sound of wood splintering filled the air, and then, suddenly, The door gave way. Fresh air hit Amanda's face. She stumbled forward, stepping onto the porch. She was free. She grabbed Jocelyn and ran. The man had his phone out, dialing 911, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Yeah, hey, I've got Amanda Berry. She's alive." The words sent shockwaves through the city. The nightmare was about to end. Amanda Berry clutched Jocelyn's hand as she stumbled onto the porch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun was blinding after years in the dim, suffocating confines of Seymour Avenue. Amanda felt the world spinning around her. Could this really be happening? The reality hit her all at once. She was outside. She was free. But Gina and Michelle were still inside. Her voice cracked as she turned to the man. "There are more girls in there. Please, we have to help them." Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The air buzzed with the sound of a city waking up to the unthinkable. The girl who had vanished a decade ago was standing in the open, alive, and screaming for help. The police arrived within minutes. Officers rushed toward her, barely able to process what they were seeing. Amanda, trembling, tried to speak through the overwhelming emotion. "He's got 2 more girls in there. Please, hurry." The officers didn't hesitate. Guns drawn, they stormed the house. Inside, Gina and Michelle had heard the commotion, the front door breaking, Amanda's screams, the sirens. It was like a dream, too surreal to believe. Michelle, chained and weak from years of starvation, held her breath as the heavy boots of officers echoed through the house. Was this another cruel trick? Then, suddenly, a voice. "Police, if you're in here, call out." For the first time in over a decade, hope burst through the darkness. Michelle tried to scream, but her voice was hoarse from years of silence. She pounded against the walls, rattling her chains. "We're here, please. We're in here." A second later, the door was forced open. Flashlights cut through the room, and then faces, uniformed officers, real, human faces. Gina's sobs filled the air as she fell into their arms, her frail body shaking violently. Michelle, barely able to move, was lifted into the embrace of her rescuers. They were free. Outside, the street was a flurry of flashing lights, horrified neighbors, and news cameras scrambling to capture history unfolding in real time. In the chaos, Amanda turned her head toward the street, and there, standing at the edge of it all, was Ariel Castro. He had returned. For a split second their eyes met. His expression was unreadable. Shock, rage, maybe even fear. But it didn't matter anymore. Within seconds, officers tackled him to the ground. The monster who had stolen a decade of their lives was finally in chains. As he was dragged to a police cruiser, Amanda, Gina, and Michelle clung to their rescuers. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. The news of their escape spread like wildfire. The world was in shock. 3 women, missing for years, assumed dead, had been alive all along, trapped in the heart of their own city. The more the world learned about the horrors of 2207 Seymour Avenue, the more unthinkable it became. The house was a fortress of pain, chains bolted to the walls, windows sealed shut, rooms filled with makeshift prisons. Ariel Castro had built a kingdom of torment, and for years no one had known. But now, he would answer for his crimes. At his trial, Castro sat emotionless as the women he had tortured spoke their truths. Michelle Knight, who had endured the worst of his brutality, stood in court and faced him directly. "You took 11 years of my life," she said, her voice unwavering, "but I got my life back. I spent 11 years in hell. Now, your hell is just beginning." He showed no remorse. Instead, he claimed that he wasn't a monster, that he was sick, but not evil. No one believed him. In August 2013, Castro was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Plus 1,000 years. It wasn't enough to undo the damage he had caused, but it was enough to ensure he would never hurt another soul again. A month later, he was found dead in his prison cell. He had hanged himself. Some called it justice. Others called it an escape. But for Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, it no longer mattered. They had survived. For years, they had been buried in the shadows, reduced to memories on missing posters. Now, they were free to step into the light. Amanda raised Jocelyn in freedom, giving her the childhood she had been robbed of. Gina reunited with her family, who had never given up hope. Michelle, who had suffered the longest, rebuilt her life, refusing to let her past define her. Their names would never be forgotten, not as victims, but as survivors. And the house on Seymour Avenue? It was demolished. A fitting end to a place that should never have existed at all. Story 2. On the 28th of May, 1985, the quiet town of Riverside, California, was shaken by an event that would thrust it into the national spotlight. It began like so many other tragedies, whispers and rumors in the local community. But what followed would reveal a sinister undercurrent of violence that many had never seen coming. The story of the Black Panther cult began years earlier, under the leadership of a man who would come to be known as Brother Carl, a charismatic figure with an iron grip on his followers. Carl was not content to simply exist within the societal norms of his time. His vision of power, control, and discipline was far from ordinary. He sought to build something larger, something his followers would blindly devote themselves to, something that would change the world. The origins of Carl's movement were rooted in dissatisfaction with the way society treated those who were marginalized. But the group he created was anything but a peaceful protest against injustice. Carl's teachings were built on a mixture of extreme radicalism, survivalism, and mind control. And it wasn't long before the Black Panther cult began to take shape. Carl's followers, primarily disillusioned young men and women, found themselves drawn to his message of empowerment. They were promised a life of purpose, a life where they could escape the oppression they had experienced in society. Under his guidance, they were taught that they were superior to the outside world, that they were destined for greatness. But there was a darker side to the group's teachings. The cult members were also instructed to abandon their families and their former lives, fully surrendering to Carl's authority. For those who joined the Black Panther cult, there was no turning back. As the group grew in size, so too did Carl's control over his followers. The teachings became more extreme, and the group's practices began to raise eyebrows. What had once appeared to be a movement based on empowerment slowly morphed into something far more dangerous. Carl's ability to manipulate and control his followers had turned the group into a ticking time bomb, and no one outside the cult could understand the full extent of the danger they posed. It wasn't just Carl who wielded power within the group. His second in command, a woman named Linda, was equally ruthless and just as determined to see Carl's vision through. Together, they formed a partnership that allowed them to tighten their grip on the Black Panther cult, forcing their followers to comply with ever-increasing demands. The group's teachings began to take on a fanatical edge, with Carl telling his followers that they were chosen for a higher purpose, one that would bring about a violent reckoning with the world they saw as corrupt. By the mid-1980s, the Black Panther cult had grown large enough to begin carrying out acts of violence in the name of their cause. They saw themselves as soldiers in a revolution, but instead of fighting for justice or equality, they were preparing for an uprising that would see them take control of Riverside and, eventually, the world. And so, on that fateful May Day in 1985, the Black Panther cult's violent tendencies came to the forefront. The first sign of trouble came when one of the cult members, a young woman named Rachel, attempted to leave the group. Rachel had grown disillusioned with Carl's increasing demands and the oppressive environment he had created. She had been raised in a family that valued independence, and she couldn't stand to be controlled any longer. But leaving the cult was not an option. As she attempted to flee, Carl's followers hunted her down, and she was dragged back to the compound. The punishment for those who attempted to escape the Black Panther cult was swift and brutal. Carl believed that anyone who tried to abandon the cause was a traitor, and that they had to be dealt with accordingly. In Rachel's case, the punishment would be death. Carl's followers, now fully indoctrinated, stood by as Rachel was executed in a ritualistic manner. Her death was not just a punishment. It was a message. It was a warning to anyone who might try to leave the group. The Black Panther cult's rule was absolute, and no one could defy Carl without facing dire consequences. Rachel's execution sent shockwaves through the community, but what followed was even more chilling. As the cult's violent tendencies became more apparent, Carl began to prepare for something far more sinister, a full-scale attack on the town of Riverside. Carl's plan was nothing short of apocalyptic. He had convinced his followers that society was on the brink of collapse, and that they needed to act swiftly to take control. The Black Panther cult would be the ones to lead the charge, eliminating anyone who stood in their way. The cult was growing increasingly armed and prepared for war. But while Carl and his followers were preparing for what they saw as a righteous uprising, the authorities were growing increasingly concerned about the group's activities. Law enforcement began to take notice of the reports of violence, disappearances, and increasingly erratic behavior from cult members. Still, it wasn't until Rachel's death that the full scope of the cult's danger became apparent. As the Black Panther cult continued to spiral deeper into violence, the authorities knew they had to act. As the Black Panther cult's violent tendencies reached new heights, the authorities in Riverside knew they couldn't ignore the growing threat any longer. The cult's leader, Carl, had created an empire built on fear, manipulation, and intimidation. For months, law enforcement had been gathering intelligence, trying to piece together the full extent of the danger lurking just beyond the city's borders. But Carl had kept his followers close, operating in secrecy, and the full scope of his operation remained just out of reach. The death of Rachel had sent a shockwave through the community. It was a brutal act, but it was also a clear declaration of the cult's power and their willingness to carry out even the most horrific of deeds. Rachel's murder had been meant as a warning, a reminder to everyone who might have doubted Carl's authority that defiance would be met with punishment. As the cult's power continued to grow, the town of Riverside began to realize just how dangerous Carl's vision was becoming. For the residents of the town, the atmosphere was one of growing dread. The Black Panther cult had become an omnipresent shadow over their lives. Though most of the cult members lived in a secluded compound on the outskirts of Riverside, their influence stretched far beyond their physical boundaries. The townspeople had begun to feel as though they were being watched, even in their own homes. Cult members would appear unannounced at local businesses, asking questions, asserting dominance, and subtly spreading Carl's message. Meanwhile, Carl's paranoia was growing. He believed that the world was on the brink of collapse, and that the time for revolution was near. Every new recruit was indoctrinated into his worldview, taught that only through violence and submission to his will could they survive the coming collapse of society. He spoke of an impending uprising, one that would see the world reshaped according to his principles. But for Carl and his followers, that uprising was not a distant dream. It was coming soon, and it was coming fast. As the situation escalated, law enforcement began to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. They knew it was only a matter of time before Carl would take matters into his own hands. The police had already received numerous reports of armed cult members and increasingly violent acts. But what they hadn't expected was how well prepared the Black Panther cult was for the fight. Carl had taken great care to arm his followers. He had trained them in combat and survival tactics, teaching them to be self-sufficient and ready for anything. The compound was fortified, with armed guards keeping watch at all hours. To Carl, the cult was not just a group of followers. It was an army that was ready to overthrow the established order. By the summer of 1985, tensions reached a breaking point. Law enforcement had received reports that the cult was planning something big, something that would involve a violent confrontation with the outside world. It was unclear what exactly the cult had in mind, but authorities knew they couldn't take any chances. As the police prepared for what they feared might be an all-out assault, Carl continued to rally his followers. He told them that their time was coming, that the world would soon recognize the power of the Black Panther cult, and that they would take their place as the new rulers of society. But to Carl's followers, this wasn't just a battle for control. It was a battle for survival. As the days passed, law enforcement began to close in on the cult. Surveillance teams were set up around the compound, and officers quietly moved into the area, hoping to gather enough evidence to arrest Carl and his closest allies. But Carl was no fool. He knew the authorities were watching, and he had taken precautions to ensure that his operation would remain hidden from prying eyes. On the 15th of August, the tension reached its peak. The Riverside Police Department, in coordination with federal agencies, launched a full-scale raid on the Black Panther cult's compound. The operation was carefully planned, with SWAT teams positioned around the property and backup on standby. They had to act quickly. They knew Carl and his followers would not go down without a fight. The raid was swift, but it wasn't without its challenges. As the officers stormed the compound, they were met with fierce resistance. Cult members, armed and trained, fought back with everything they had. The compound was turned into a battleground, with gunfire echoing through the night air. The police, though well-equipped, were faced with an enemy that was not only well-armed, but highly motivated to defend Carl's vision. The firefight lasted for hours, and by the time it was over, the compound had been heavily damaged. Several cult members were arrested, but Carl himself was nowhere to be found. The authorities had successfully broken through the cult's defenses, but Carl had vanished into the night, taking with him his most loyal followers. The aftermath of the raid was chaotic. Law enforcement had succeeded in dismantling the Black Panther cult's operations, but Carl's escape left them with more questions than answers. The authorities had dealt a blow to the cult, but they knew that Carl was not a man who would go quietly into the shadows. The hunt for him was just beginning. Carl was gone. He wasn't just running, he was planning. Every abandoned house, every stretch of wilderness, every possible hiding place was scrutinized. But Carl had planned for this moment long before the raid ever happened. He had built contingency plans, secret locations, and fallback positions. Deep in the California desert, miles away from prying eyes, Carl and his remaining followers regrouped. They had lost their compound, their weapons, and their numbers had been cut down. But to Carl, this was only a temporary setback. He saw himself as more than just a man. He was a prophet. And prophets don't fall so easily. It wasn't long before Carl was back to doing what he did best: manipulating, controlling, and preparing for revenge. Using the network he had built over the years, Carl reached out to former cult members who had avoided capture. Some had scattered after the raid, trying to blend into society, but others were still devoted, still waiting for his command. Through secret meetings and coded messages, Carl began to rebuild. The FBI, now fully involved, poured resources into tracking Carl down. Witnesses were questioned, former cult members interrogated, phone lines tapped. His face was plastered on wanted posters across the state, and rumors swirled about where he could be hiding. Then, a breakthrough. One of Carl's former enforcers, one of the men who had been at his side since the beginning, was picked up in a routine traffic stop. The man had changed his appearance, cut his hair, and tried to disappear into the background, but something about him felt off to the officers who pulled him over. When they ran his fingerprints, the connection was made. At first, the man refused to talk, but after hours of interrogation, he finally cracked. Carl was hiding, not in the wilderness, not in another state. He was right there in California, operating out of an abandoned farmhouse near the edge of a small, quiet town, a town that had no idea they were harboring one of the most dangerous fugitives in the country. Law enforcement didn't hesitate. A tactical team was assembled. This time, they wouldn't risk him slipping through their fingers. This time, they would be ready. The operation was planned down to the second. Just before dawn, A convoy of black SUVs and armored vehicles crept toward the isolated farmhouse. Inside, Carl and his remaining followers had no idea that their time was running out. With the element of surprise on their side, law enforcement struck hard and fast. The first breach team stormed the farmhouse, clearing room after room. The silence of the early morning was shattered by shouting, the crack of gunfire, and the sounds of boots pounding against wooden floors. Carl's followers fought back. They had been trained for this. They had been waiting for this. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one, they were taken down. Some arrested, others killed in the chaos. And then at last, there was Carl. He had barricaded himself in an upstairs bedroom, a single pistol in his hand. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The man who had once controlled an army, the man who had convinced so many to kill, to die, to give up their lives for him. He was now alone. The officers gave him one chance, one last moment to surrender. Carl didn't take it. The gunshot echoed through the house. By the time the officers broke through the door, Carl's body was already slumped against the wall. The man who had seen himself as a revolutionary, a prophet, a leader, had chosen his own ending. With Carl dead, the Black Panther cult officially collapsed. Those who hadn't already been arrested were soon tracked down, their influence fading into nothing more than whispers of a dark past. But the damage had already been done. Story 3. The Move Bombing. On the 13th of May, 1985, Philadelphia was on the brink of an event that would change the course of its history forever. The tension had been building for years, an unease that gripped both the authorities and the residents of the city. On this fateful day, it was not just the ground that would shake, but the very foundation of trust between the police and the people of West Philadelphia. At the center of this turmoil was MOVE, a radical group that had made its home in the neighborhood for over a decade. The group, led by John Africa, was controversial from the start. Their teachings, which mixed environmentalism, anti-authoritarianism, and an unwavering rejection of modern society, quickly put them at odds with the surrounding community. But MOVE's resistance to authority went beyond just words. It was reflected in their behavior. The organization lived in a commune at 6221 Osage Avenue, a compound that had become infamous for its standoffs with local police. MOVE members believed they were fighting against the corruption of the government and the injustices of the world around them. But their message, while powerful to some, created growing tensions with their neighbors. Loud protests, confrontations with authorities, and an escalating standoff with law enforcement were starting to take a toll on everyone in the area. For the residents of West Philadelphia, the sight of MOVE's members, most of whom were armed and fiercely protective of their leader, became a frightening daily reality. Neighbors complained about the noise, the strange behavior, and increasingly hostile interactions with the group. But it wasn't just the people in the community who were on edge. The local police department, already weary from years of unsuccessful attempts to resolve the situation, felt as though they were running out of options. By 1985, the situation had reached a boiling point. MOVE had become a constant thorn in the side of the authorities. The police had conducted numerous raids, trying to disband the group and arrest members on various charges, including the alleged murder of a police officer. But each attempt had been met with fierce resistance. MOVE had proven time and again that they would not go quietly, no matter what it cost. And so, the Philadelphia Police Department, under the authority of Mayor Wilson Goode, decided to take more drastic action. On that Tuesday afternoon, the plan was put into motion. The idea was to eliminate MOVE once and for all, but the method they chose, one that involved dropping a bomb, would have devastating consequences that no one could have predicted. The Philadelphia police, backed by the FBI, had come up with a strategy they believed would end the standoff quickly and decisively. The plan was to bomb the MOVE compound from the sky, using a helicopter to drop a bomb onto the roof of their house, hoping to force the group to surrender. This was not an ordinary raid. This was an attempt to break the group's hold on the city through sheer force. The authorities believed that the MOVE members were a dangerous, uncontrollable threat, and that drastic measures were necessary. At 5:30 p.m., a police helicopter flew overhead, carrying a bomb packed with explosive powder. The decision to drop the bomb was made in a matter of minutes, and it was to have a lasting effect on everyone involved. As the bomb struck the roof of the MOVE compound, the impact was catastrophic. An explosion erupted, followed by a towering inferno. The fire spread quickly, engulfing the building and the surrounding homes, turning the block into a war zone. The bomb not only destroyed the MOVE compound, but also set fire to the houses nearby. The intense heat made it impossible for firefighters to get close enough to fight the flames. They were forced to watch helplessly as the fire consumed everything in its path. The police too were caught in a dilemma. They had initiated the attack but had underestimated the scale of the destruction. Once the fire started to rage out of control, it became clear that this wasn't just about breaking up a radical group. It was about controlling the damage. The reality of the situation had shifted from a targeted operation to an uncontrolled disaster. The bomb had set off a chain reaction of chaos, and the consequences were unfolding far beyond anyone's expectations. In the midst of the devastation, the MOVE members remained inside their compound. At least 11 people, 6 adults and 5 children, would perish in the fire. Among them was John Africa, the leader of MOVE. The group, which had long been the center of tension in the city, was now being wiped out, not by a confrontation, but by an aerial assault that would mark a new chapter in the history of law enforcement. As the fire raged on, the people of Philadelphia watched in stunned silence. The decision to drop a bomb on the MOVE compound had seemed like a desperate but calculated move by the authorities. Yet, in the aftermath, it was clear that no one could have anticipated the overwhelming destruction that followed. The immediate loss of life was staggering. 11 people, including 5 children, had been killed. Among them was John Africa, the leader of MOVE, whose philosophy had been the driving force behind the group's radical stance. The fire had claimed the lives of nearly the entire group, and by the time the flames subsided, the MOVE compound was reduced to nothing more than a smoldering pile of rubble. But the tragedy didn't end there. As the fire spread beyond the compound, it engulfed the surrounding block, destroying dozens of homes. Entire families, innocent bystanders, had lost everything in an instant. The neighborhood, once a place where people lived their lives in relative peace, had been transformed into a war zone. The impact of that single decision, dropping a bomb, had shattered the lives of countless people. What followed the bombing was a wave of confusion and disbelief. Many in the city were left grappling with a single question. How could the authorities have allowed this to happen? The very idea of a bomb being dropped in a residential neighborhood seemed unfathomable. It was an act of violence that left the people of Philadelphia feeling betrayed, as though their safety had been sacrificed in the name of ending a standoff. In the wake of the destruction, the police and city officials quickly realized the gravity of their actions. Mayor Wilson Goode, who had authorized the bombing, found himself in the eye of a growing storm. The initial defense of the bombing, that it was a necessary step to remove a dangerous group, soon began to fall apart as the scope of the devastation became clearer. As the city began to assess the damage, it became painfully obvious that the MOVE bombing had been more than just a tactical error. It had been a catastrophic failure in judgment, one that could not be undone by mere apologies. The loss of life, the destruction of homes, and the utter devastation of an entire block would leave scars that would never fully heal. The outrage was immediate. Civil rights organizations, local activists, and community leaders began to demand accountability from the city's leadership. Protests erupted in the streets, and calls for justice grew louder by the day. For many, the bombing represented an example of unchecked power, an act of government overreach that had claimed innocent lives. The fallout wasn't just emotional, it was political. Mayor Goode faced increasing pressure from both local and national groups, demanding that he take responsibility for the bombing. Despite his initial defense of the operation, the mounting criticism made it clear that the city's leadership could not escape the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, the survivors of the bombing were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The MOVE members who had managed to escape the fire were left to deal with not only the physical trauma, but also the psychological wounds of the attack. The children who had survived, some of whom had witnessed the deaths of their family members, would carry the emotional weight of that day for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of the bombing was the profound sense of betrayal felt by the residents of West Philadelphia. For years, they had been caught in the crossfire of the MOVE standoff, but they had never anticipated that their own homes and neighborhoods would be the price for the resolution. The explosion of that bomb, followed by the uncontrollable fire, left families with nothing but memories of what they once had. As time passed, the questions only deepened. How had the city reached a point where the bombing of an entire neighborhood seemed like an acceptable solution? Had MOVE, with all its radical beliefs, truly warranted such extreme measures? And most haunting of all, why had the authorities felt the need to go so far? The investigation into the bombing was a long and complicated process. The city formed a special commission to look into the events of May 13, 1985, hoping to find answers to the many questions that remained. The commission's findings were damning. They concluded that the bombing was both unnecessary and reckless, and that the city's leaders had failed in their duty to protect the lives of their citizens. The decision to drop the bomb had been made hastily, without full consideration of the potential consequences. The commission also noted that the police had failed to properly assess the risks involved and had acted without a clear plan to handle the aftermath. Despite the findings of the commission, the city's response to the tragedy was slow. For many, the lack of immediate accountability from the leadership was a further blow to an already broken community. The city was forced to pay restitution to the victims' families and provide compensation for the destruction of homes. Story 4. The Gacy Murders. On the cold December evening of 1978, the streets of Norwood Park, a quiet suburb of Chicago, were lined with twinkling Christmas lights. The air smelled of snow and pine, and families were settling in for the holiday season. But inside the home of John Wayne Gacy, something far more sinister was unfolding. The teenage boy had gone missing. His name was Robert Piest, a 15-year-old who had vanished without a trace just hours after telling his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a potential job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. At first, Robert's disappearance seemed like just another runaway case. Teenagers left home all the time, the police reasoned. Maybe he had gotten cold feet about his plans. Maybe he had stayed out too late with friends. But his parents knew better. Robert wasn't the kind of boy who ran away. Something had happened to him. Something terrible. And in the days that followed, as the police began digging deeper into the last man to see Robert alive, they would uncover horrors beyond their worst nightmares. John Wayne Gacy was a well-known figure in his community. He was the friendly contractor, the devoted Democratic precinct captain, and the man who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain sick children at local hospitals. People trusted him. They invited him into their homes. They saw the wide smile, the painted face, the bright-colored costume, but they never saw the monster underneath. For years, Gacy had lived a double life. By day, he was a respected businessman. By night, he was a predator, luring teenage boys into his home under the guise of offering them work, money, or simply a friendly ear. Once inside, the walls of his house bore witness to unspeakable terror. But Gacy was careful. He was methodical. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to deflect suspicion. He had been arrested once before, years earlier, for sexually assaulting a teenage boy, but he had convinced the world that he had changed, that it was all in the past, and people had believed him. They believed him even as boys continued to disappear. Robert Piest's disappearance was different. His parents refused to let his case be ignored. The police, already stretched thin, finally decided to look into Gacy. A routine check, just to rule him out. But when they arrived at his house, something was off. There was the unmistakable smell of decay. Faint, but there. lingering beneath the scent of air fresheners and cigarettes. And then there was Gacy himself. Calm, collected, but too confident, too sure that he was untouchable. He laughed with the officers, even joked with them, but there was something unsettling in his demeanor. Something that told the investigators that they needed to dig deeper. They ran his name. And then the past came rushing back. The previous charges, the accusations, the whispers of young men disappearing after crossing paths with him. And then, crucial mistake. During a routine search of his home, an officer happened upon a receipt. A receipt belonging to Robert Pease. It was the thread that would unravel the entire web. With enough evidence to obtain a search warrant, the police returned to Gacy's house. This time, they weren't just looking around. They were tearing the place apart. And then they found it, beneath the floorboards of Gacy's crawl space. Buried in the damp, suffocating darkness, they discovered the first body. And then, another. And another. The search became an excavation. One by one, the remains of young men, boys really, were pulled from the earth. The horror mounted as investigators realized they weren't dealing with just one or two victims. They were uncovering a graveyard. By the time they were done, 29 bodies had been recovered from beneath Gacy's home. 4 more were found elsewhere. The community, the city, the entire nation was shaken to its core. The friendly neighborhood contractor had been hiding the bodies of his victims beneath his feet for years. And worse yet, he had kept killing, even as suspicion grew around him. Once arrested, Gacy's facade cracked. No longer the charming, community-driven businessman, he became something else entirely. He toyed with investigators, alternating between confession and denial, amusement and indifference. He claimed he had dissociative identity disorder, that Jack had done the killings, not him, that he didn't remember, that the boys had entered his home alive but left in someone else's hands. But the evidence spoke for itself. The horror of what John Wayne Gacy had done was undeniable. The faces of his victims, their stolen youth, their broken families, became the true faces of this case. And the trial? It was only the beginning. The courtroom was silent. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. On one side sat the families of the victims, their faces etched with grief. On the other, members of the press, eager to report on the man now dubbed the Killer Clown. And at the center of it all sat John Wayne Gacy, the man who had spent years hiding death beneath his floorboards. For the first time, the world would hear the full scope of his crimes. Every chilling detail, every horrifying moment. And Gacy? He seemed unbothered. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February 6, 1980. It would become one of the most notorious legal battles in American history. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the horrors he had inflicted. They painted a picture of a man who had preyed on teenage boys, lured them in with promises of work or money, then subjected them to unspeakable torment before burying them like discarded trash. The evidence was overwhelming. Crime scene photos, autopsy reports, testimonies from survivors, young men who had barely escaped with their lives, and, perhaps most damning of all, Gacy's own words, because Gacy had confessed. In a moment of arrogance, he had told officers everything. How he had handcuffed his victims, how he had tricked them into submission, how he had laughed as he tightened the rope around their necks. But now, in court, he changed his tune. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His lawyers had a strategy. Convince the jury that John Wayne Gacy wasn't responsible for his actions, that the man before them had been controlled by something else. A mental illness, a fractured mind, a darkness he couldn't contain. They introduced the idea of multiple personalities, that sometimes he was John, other times he was Jack, that Jack had been the one who killed, not the man sitting in the courtroom. They brought in psychiatrists, experts who analyzed his erratic behavior, his disturbing childhood, his past trauma. They wanted the jury to believe that Gacy hadn't been in control, that he was as much a victim of his own mind as the boys he had buried beneath his house. But the jury wasn't convinced, because as the weeks dragged on, as witness after witness took the stand, a pattern emerged. John Wayne Gacy wasn't a man consumed by madness. He was cold, calculated, evil. The turning point in the trial came when survivors, young men who had encountered Gacy but managed to escape, took the stand. One by one, they told their stories. The man who had offered them jobs, who had smiled and joked and seemed like a father figure. The handcuff trick. The way his expression would shift from friendly to something else. The suffocating terror as they realized they weren't getting out alive. And the laughter. Every single survivor described it. That eerie, mocking laugh as he tormented them. That was not the sound of a man struggling with insanity. That was the sound of a man who enjoyed what he was doing. On March 12, 1980, after only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted. Some families wept with relief. Others stared at Gacy, hoping for some sign of remorse. But he remained emotionless. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, he simply smirked. "They can kill me," he said, "but they'll never find them all." The meaning of those words would haunt investigators for years to come. Because despite the 33 confirmed victims, many believe there were more. And Gacy, he took that secret to his grave. Story 5. Cindy James. On June 19, 1989, a group of children playing near an abandoned house in Richmond, British Columbia, stumbled upon something hidden in the weeds, a single black shoe. As they moved closer, their innocent curiosity turned to horror. Lying in a ditch nearby was the lifeless body of a woman. Her hands and feet were bound, and a stocking was wrapped tightly around her neck. The terror on her face was unmistakable. This was no ordinary death. The woman was Cindy James, a 44-year-old nurse. And for 7 years, she had told anyone who would listen that she was being stalked, threatened, hunted. Now, she was dead. It had all begun in October 1982. Cindy, a well-respected nurse, had once led a peaceful life. But that changed the day she received the first phone call. On the other end of the line was silence, long, heavy, menacing. Then came the whispering, the breathing. Sometimes the voice was low and taunting. Other times, there were no words at all, just the unsettling presence of someone listening. At first, she tried to ignore it, but then the letters arrived. Cryptic, threatening messages scrawled in jagged handwriting. Some contained disturbing images. Others were short and direct. "You're dead." Then the break-in started. She returned home one evening to find her pillows slashed open, the stuffing ripped apart and tossed across the bed. Another time, she found her porch lights shattered. She reported everything to the police, but there was little they could do. Without evidence of an intruder, her claims were impossible to prove. Then, the attacks became physical. On January 27, 1983, Cindy's friend received a frantic call and rushed to her house. Inside, Cindy was sprawled across the floor, semi-conscious, her face pale, a stocking wrapped around her neck. She could barely speak. She described being attacked from behind, strangled until she nearly lost consciousness, but there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing. Despite the disturbing nature of the assault, investigators were skeptical. If someone had broken in, why weren't there any footprints? Why wasn't anything stolen? Cindy's terror didn't wane. She changed her locks. She moved houses. She even hired a private investigator, Ozzy Caban, hoping to catch the stalker before it was too late. But the threats only escalated. Over the next few years, Cindy endured a relentless campaign of fear. Police discovered her phone lines had been cut multiple times. Dead animals were left on her doorstep. Someone prowled outside her windows at night. But every time she called for help, the figure vanished before officers arrived. She was found beaten and drugged more than once, barely clinging to consciousness. One night she was discovered in a ditch, miles from home, confused and injured. A hypodermic needle mark was found on her arm. Someone had injected her with morphine. Yet, there were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no suspects. The police began to suspect the unthinkable. What if Cindy was staging the attacks herself? She denied it. A private investigator denied it. But with no solid leads, the case became a twisted puzzle. As the years dragged on, Cindy's mental health deteriorated. She was trapped in a nightmare that no one seemed willing to believe. And then, one day, she vanished. Cindy James had spent 7 years trapped in a cycle of fear, stalked, threatened, and repeatedly attacked by a faceless tormentor. Each incident was more disturbing than the last, yet no one had ever seen her assailant. There were no witnesses, no concrete evidence, and no clear suspects. By 1989, Cindy was exhausted. The weight of constant terror had taken its toll. She had moved multiple times, changed her name, and even sought psychiatric help, but nothing stopped the threats. Then, on May 25th, 1989, she disappeared. That afternoon, Cindy had gone to the bank to deposit a check. She then stopped by a local pharmacy to pick up some medication. These were routine errands, ordinary tasks that should have taken no more than an hour. But Cindy never came home. Her car was found abandoned in a parking lot, just blocks away from the pharmacy. The driver's side door was unlocked, and inside the vehicle, police found disturbing clues. The contents of her purse were scattered across the front seat. Her credit cards had been pulled out and left in disarray. Beneath the car, someone had placed the key to her ignition, as if deliberately hiding it. Most chilling of all, there were traces of blood on the door handle. It was as if Cindy had vanished in the middle of a struggle. Friends, family, and investigators scoured the area, hoping to find any trace of Cindy. Days passed with no sign of her. Police questioned those closest to her. Had she mentioned any plans to leave town? Had she spoken of self-harm? Theories began to swirl. Had Cindy finally decided to escape the fear that had controlled her life for years? Or had the person who tormented her for so long finally caught up to her? Then, on June 8, 1989, 2 weeks after she went missing, a group of children playing near an abandoned house stumbled upon a shoe lying in the weeds. Just a few feet away, in a ditch, they found her body. Cindy was lying on her side, her hands and feet tightly bound. A black nylon stocking had been wrapped around her neck. Her clothes were missing. The sight was grotesque, as if she had suffered immensely before dying. But something didn't add up. Her body showed no signs of struggle. There were no bruises, no marks of restraint. Even more strangely, an autopsy revealed she had died of a morphine overdose. Investigators were baffled. If she had been drugged, how had she managed to tie herself up? And why would she go through such elaborate lengths to stage her own death? The more they examined the case, the less it made sense. The official ruling: suicide. The official ruling. Police argued that Cindy, overwhelmed by years of paranoia and fear, had taken her own life. Perhaps she had injected herself with a fatal dose of morphine, tied herself up in some way they couldn't explain, and let the drugs take effect. Her family refused to believe it. Her father, Otto Hack, was furious at the conclusion. He insisted that Cindy would never have been able to bind herself in such a manner, especially under the influence of morphine. And what about the years of stalking? The break-ins? The threats? Did the police truly believe that she had done all of it to herself? Then Cindy's private investigator, Ozzy Caban, was skeptical. He had seen her in states of real terror. He had been with her when she was drugged, when she was found battered and bruised. If this was all a delusion, she had been the most convincing actor he had ever seen. To this day, her death remains one of Canada's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. Story 6. A Bowling Alley Massacre. On the morning of February 10, 1990, the quiet town of Las Cruces, New Mexico, stirred to life under the glow of a rising sun. Families prepared for the day, shopkeepers unlocked their doors, and at a small, locally owned bowling alley on East Amador Avenue, the staff readied the lanes for another Saturday of business. It should have been an ordinary morning, but by 8:30 a.m., the sunlit alley would become a crime scene. One of the most horrific unsolved massacres in American history. Two men walked through the unlocked back door of Las Cruces Bowl, armed and ready. Within minutes, they would unleash terror and violence, leaving behind a blood-stained floor, shattered lives, and a case that remains a chilling mystery to this day. Inside the bowling alley, 34-year-old Stephanie Sent, the manager, was in her office counting the previous night's earnings. Her 12-year-old daughter, Melissa Rapace, had accompanied her that morning, keeping busy while her mother worked. Near the kitchen, Stephanie's 13-year-old employee, Amy Hauser, had just arrived to begin her shift. Out in the front, a cook named Steve Tarrant was preparing food orders for the day. His two young daughters, Paula, 2 years old, and Valerie, 6 years old, had been brought along, waiting patiently as their father would. It was a peaceful, everyday routine. Then, the back door swung open. Two armed men stepped inside. Their identities were obscured. One was described as a Hispanic male in his 30s, the other younger, possibly in his 20s. They weren't just robbers. Without warning, the men forced everyone into Stephanie's office, demanding the safe be opened. Stephanie complied, handing over an estimated $5,000 in cash. But these men weren't satisfied with money alone. They ordered the victims to the ground. Then, they opened fire. Bullets tore through flesh and bone. No one was spared, not even the 2-year-old child. The gunmen believed they had finished the job. They doused papers with gasoline and set the office on fire, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation. The flames crackled, smoke filled the air, and the intruders disappeared into the morning light. But against all odds, there were survivors. Despite suffering multiple gunshot wounds, 12-year-old Melissa Rapace was still breathing. Her mother, Stephanie, was alive but gravely injured. Amy Hauser, the young employee, was gone. With unimaginable strength, Melissa dragged herself across the floor, bleeding heavily, and reached a phone. At 8:33 a.m., she dialed 911. Her voice trembled, her breathing labored, but she gave as much information as she could. "We've been shot. At the bowling alley. It was 2 men. Please hurry." The dispatcher struggled to get more details, but Melissa was slipping in and out of consciousness. The call was their only chance. Paramedics and police arrived within minutes. Smoke was still rising from the office, and the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. The survivors were barely clinging to life. 6 people had been shot. 3 would never wake up again. Amy Hauser, Steve Tarrant, Paula Haldwin. Melissa and her mother, Stephanie, were rushed to the hospital along with Valerie, who had miraculously survived, though she had suffered gunshot wounds to the head. But the killers? They were gone without a trace. The bullets had stopped, but the horror of what happened inside Las Cruces Bowl on February 10th, 1990, was far from over. The survivors had been rushed to the hospital. 3 innocent lives were lost, and 2 men, killers who had executed a crime so senseless and brutal, had vanished into the early morning light, leaving behind nothing but blood and smoke. The Las Cruces Police Department arrived within minutes, but they were already at a disadvantage. The fire had destroyed potential evidence. The gunmen had planned their escape with precision, and the only person who could describe them in detail, a 12-year-old girl who had been shot in the head, was fighting for her life. As detectives combed through the crime scene, they found clear signs that this was never just a robbery. The safe was empty, but the brutality of the attack went far beyond a simple cash grab. The men had executed their victims even after taking the money. They had shot a 2-year-old child. They had set the place on fire, ensuring maximum destruction. This wasn't just greed. This was meant to send a message, despite the pain and trauma she endured. 12-year-old Melissa Rapace became the key witness in the case. In her hospital bed, she was able to give detectives a description of the 2 men who had attacked them. Suspect 1, a Hispanic male in his 30s, possibly 5'10", with dark hair and a thick mustache. Suspect 2, a younger Hispanic male, likely in his 20s, slightly shorter, with no facial hair. They were cold, calculated, and worst of all, they seemed to vanish into thin air. But something about their behavior didn't make sense. Forensic specialists estimated that the entire attack lasted at least 10 minutes. That's an eternity for a robbery. They had the money within the first 2 minutes. So why did they stick around to execute their victims? Why take the time to set the office on fire? It was as if their primary goal wasn't money at all. Months passed, then years, and the Las Cruces Police Department was still no closer to solving the case. The case never moved forward. No suspects were arrested. No further evidence was found. The 2 gunmen had entered a bowling alley in broad daylight, executed an entire family, and disappeared forever. Their faces were never seen again. To this day, the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre remains one of the most haunting cold cases in the United States. Story 7, The Acid Man. On the 7th of October 1999, the quiet streets of Lahore, Pakistan, bore no hint of the unspeakable horrors unfolding behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home. As the sun set and families settled in for the night, a monstrous figure began his dark work, unaware that his reign of terror would soon come to an end. Aved Iqbal, a name that would later send shockwaves through the nation, had already been living in the shadows for years. He was a man of many faces, a seemingly ordinary man day, a chilling predator by night. But by the end of the year, his face would be burned into the memories of millions, and his gruesome crimes would shake the very foundation of Pakistan's society. Born in 1956, Javed Iqbal initially led a life that appeared unremarkable. He had a steady job, a family, and blended into the background of the bustling city of Lahore. But lurking beneath this facade was a deep darkness, a hunger that Iqbal could no longer control. It wasn't enough for him to simply live a life of quiet normalcy. His true nature would soon be revealed, and it would be as horrific as it was calculated. Iqbal's twisted obsession centered around young boys. His victims were boys, often from disadvantaged families, vulnerable and easy targets. He used his charm and status to lure them into his grip. In most cases, he promised them a better life, offering shelter and food. But the promise was a lie. He had no intention of helping them. Iqbal's only goal was to feed his insatiable appetite for terror. The nightmare began in 1998 when he took his first victim, a 16-year-old boy. Iqbal had lured him into his home under the pretense of offering him work. The boy, naive and hopeful, didn't know that Iqbal had other plans. Once inside, he was held captive, tortured, and ultimately murdered. His body was disposed of in a manner so gruesome it would send ripples through the community once the full truth was revealed. But this was only the beginning. As the months passed, Iqbal continued his rampage, and the victims began to accumulate. He was not content with just one life. Iqbal set his sights on an even darker goal. He wanted to surpass the world's most infamous serial killers. His methodical nature drove him to increase his kill count. His ultimate ambition was not simply to kill, but to capture the public's attention, to achieve infamy. It wasn't until the 7th of October, 1999, that Iqbal's dark plan began to unravel. In a shocking letter, he confessed to his crimes in a manner that was chillingly detached. The letter, which was handed over to the police by an anonymous source, outlined in graphic detail the extent of his monstrous actions. It revealed the horrifying truth that Iqbal had, over the course of the previous year, murdered at least 100 boys. His letter detailed how he had lured them into his home, torturing and killing them, and then disposing of their bodies in the most grotesque ways. The confession was both a chilling revelation and taunting admission. Iqbal didn't simply confess. He gloated over his actions. He bragged about the methods he had used, explaining how he had bound his victims, suffocated them, and even dismembered their bodies. Each murder was calculated, planned, and executed with a cold precision that left no room for remorse. Iqbal's actions were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. They were the result of years of meticulous planning and deliberate malice. He made it clear in his letter that he had no regrets. He reveled in the chaos he had caused, and in his twisted mind, he saw himself as some sort of avenger, punishing society for its sins by claiming the lives of these innocent boys. His letter was a message to the world, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew who was behind the deaths. His arrogance shone through in every word, as if he were daring the authorities to catch him. Iqbal's confession was not just a letter, it was an invitation. It was as if he wanted to be caught, wanted to be known. He believed that his crimes, his name, and his actions would be etched in history forever. He had killed, and now he wanted recognition. He wanted the world to acknowledge the depths of his depravity. But what was even more chilling was the fact that the authorities had no idea who he was. Despite his blatant confession, Iqbal managed to remain a ghost in the shadows, unseen and unfazed by the chaos he had unleashed. He had meticulously covered his tracks, leaving behind no physical evidence that could lead to his capture. He had chosen his victims carefully, knowing that they were disposable, that no one would come looking for them. But the letter was a game changer. It was the key to his eventual downfall. The police, now armed with a confession and a sense of urgency, began to investigate the man behind the words. Iqbal's past was dug up, and the portrait of a man who was both a cold-blooded killer and a master manipulator began to emerge. The investigation would lead to a horrific discovery. Iqbal had been living in plain sight, hiding in the city for years, all while carrying out his dark plans behind closed doors. His neighbors, his colleagues, and even his family had no idea that they were living alongside a monster. Iqbal had masked his true self behind the persona of an average man, blending in with the community, until the day the letter exposed him for what he truly was. The investigation into Javed Iqbal's crimes quickly intensified after the chilling letter was received by the police. The confession was detailed, methodical, and horrifying, leaving investigators grappling with the monstrous reality that they were dealing with a serial killer operating in plain sight. The contents of Iqbal's letter were enough to send shockwaves through Pakistan, and indeed the world. But it was only the beginning of what would become an extensive, harrowing search for the truth behind his reign of terror. Iqbal had meticulously outlined the methodical steps he took to lure his victims into his home. His letter described how he would approach young boys, often from impoverished families, offering them food, shelter, and the promise of work. The boys, vulnerable and desperate for a better life, never suspected that their savior was actually their executioner. Iqbal preyed upon their hopes and dreams, turning them into mere tools to satisfy his dark desires. The most chilling part of his confession was the cold detachment with which he spoke of his murders. Iqbal was not merely killing for pleasure. He viewed the act as an art, a twisted form of control. He described how he would bind the boys, suffocate them, and then dispose of their bodies in a manner so grotesque that the police had no choice but to confront the terrifying truth about the depths of his depravity. But it wasn't just the methods of his crimes that struck terror into the hearts of the investigators. It was the sheer number of victims. Iqbal claimed that he had murdered at least 100 boys, a number that seemed almost incomprehensible. He had been operating in the shadows for over a year, with no one the wiser. The scale of his killings was staggering, and the authorities had no idea where to begin their search for the bodies. Iqbal's letter had not only confessed to the murders, but also taunted the police, challenging them to find the boys he had killed. He knew he had been careful. He had chosen his victims wisely, ensuring that their disappearances went unnoticed by anyone who cared. After all, who would miss a boy from a poor family? Who would care about the life of a child who had no voice? Iqbal understood the dark reality of society's indifference, and he used it to his advantage. With the investigation now in full swing, the police turned to the one thing they had: Iqbal's confession. They began searching his home, hoping to find physical evidence that would lead them to the victims he had described. What they found was both shocking and grotesque. Hidden within the walls of his home were the remnants of his twisted activities. Photographs of his victims, detailed records of their names, and, most disturbingly, pieces of clothing and personal effects. It was clear that Iqbal had kept trophies from each of his victims, savoring the memories of his crimes as though they were precious artifacts. But even more disturbing was the discovery of Iqbal's self-made death chamber. The room where he carried out his horrific acts was a chilling testament to his sadistic nature. It was sparsely furnished, with only a few chairs and a table. The walls were lined with dark, ominous symbols and strange writings. It was as though Iqbal had transformed the space into his own personal torture chamber, a place where he could indulge in his darkest fantasies without fear of consequence. As the investigation continued, Iqbal's identity was slowly pieced together. He was a man who had lived among the people of Lahore for years, hiding in plain sight. His neighbors described him as an ordinary man, unremarkable, friendly, and polite. No one had ever suspected that the man they saw every day was capable of such unspeakable horrors. It was a chilling reminder that monsters often walk among us, disguised as ordinary people, hiding their true nature behind a mask of normalcy. The search for the bodies of Iqbal's victims was a grim task. The police scoured Lahore and its surrounding areas, following leads and attempting to piece together the fragments of the horrific puzzle Iqbal had created. But as they dug deeper into his past, they found no trace of the hundreds of missing boys he had claimed to have killed. It was as though they had simply vanished, swallowed by the earth, their lives erased without a trace. Iqbal's letter had been chilling, but it had also been taunting. He had openly mocked the authorities, daring them to find the bodies and prove that he had truly killed as many boys as he had claimed. It was a sickening game to him, one that he seemed to take perverse pleasure in. But despite his cocky demeanor, there were cracks in his facade. The police soon discovered that Iqbal had been far less careful than he had believed. Through his connections and previous contacts, Iqbal had managed to manipulate certain individuals to help him dispose of the bodies. But they were now coming forward, too terrified to remain silent. Slowly, the truth began to surface, and the horrifying scale of his crimes became undeniable. The police had him cornered. When Javed Iqbal was finally arrested, his reaction was cold and emotionless. He showed no signs of remorse for his actions, no regret for the lives he had taken. To him, it was all a game, a challenge that he had ultimately lost. But even as the authorities closed in on him, Iqbal remained defiant. He claimed that he had been forced into his actions, that his desires were out of his control, and that society itself had driven him to commit these atrocities. It was the same warped logic that serial killers often cling to, an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Iqbal's arrest did little to calm the public's outrage. His trial was a media frenzy, with the entire nation riveted by the details of his crimes. People were horrified by the sheer brutality of his actions, but they were also disgusted by the fact that he had remained undetected for so long. How had he gotten away with it? How had he been able to murder at least 100 boys without anyone noticing? As the trial of Javed Iqbal unfolded, the full scope of his monstrous crimes began to unravel in a horrific cascade of revelations. The nation's collective breath seemed to hold as details emerged, each more grotesque and chilling than the last. Iqbal's arrogance, his twisted sense of pride in his killings, left the courtroom in shock. He was unrepentant, even as the families of the victims gathered in the back, their faces etched with grief, disbelief, and rage. Iqbal's defense, if it could be called that, was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Throughout the trial, he claimed that he had acted out of a sense of social justice, believing that by killing these boys, he was ridding society of what he saw as undesirable elements. He portrayed himself as a kind of avenger, the self-proclaimed executioner of youth, whom he deemed unworthy. His defense was an appalling attempt to justify the horrifying acts he had committed, but it wasn't enough to convince anyone. Iqbal's calculated demeanor and lack of remorse only deepened the horror of his actions. He had no empathy for the lives he had taken. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. His words were chillingly detached, his eyes cold and empty as he recounted the details of his killings, each one a horrific tale of manipulation, control, and murder. The families of the victims who had managed to find their way to the courtroom were devastated. They had waited for years, clinging to the hope that their loved ones would be found, that they would receive answers. Instead, they had been forced to confront the painful truth that their sons had been nothing more than pawns in a twisted game orchestrated by a man who was both calculating and cruel. The emotional weight in the courtroom was palpable, as the parents of the murdered boys fought to hold back their tears while trying to comprehend the unfathomable horror that had taken place. Throughout the proceedings, Iqbal continued to show no remorse, no hint of guilt. He spoke of the boys he had killed with clinical precision, almost as though they were just another statistic in his sickening plan. Each of his victims was nothing more than a number to him, a part of the puzzle he had carefully constructed in his mind. He spoke of suffocating them, of binding them, of watching as their lives faded away, and then discarding their bodies as if they were nothing. And still, the bodies remained elusive. The police had scoured the city, searching for the remains of Iqbal's victims, but they had found little. His carefully laid plans had allowed him to dispose of the bodies in such a way that they had almost disappeared without a trace. Iqbal's home had been combed for evidence, but it was clear that he had taken measures to erase all traces of his gruesome deeds. He had evaded the authorities for so long that the magnitude of his crimes was almost impossible to fathom. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the weight of his confession and the testimony from his accomplices was enough to seal his fate. Iqbal's twisted game was over. The authorities had gathered enough evidence to convict him, and on February 16th, 2001, he was sentenced to death by hanging for his gruesome acts. Story 8. The Keddie Cabin Murders. The town of Keddie, California, was the kind of place where people went to disappear, not in a sinister way, but to escape the chaos of city life. A former railroad stop in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Keddie had transformed into a quiet vacation retreat, surrounded by dense forests and the whisper of pine trees. But by April 1981, its charm was fading. The once bustling Keddie resort had grown shabby, its cabins rented out to low-income families looking for a fresh start. One of those families was the Sharps. Glenna Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old single mother, had moved to cabin 28 with her 5 children: John, 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5. It wasn't paradise, but it was affordable. Sue did her best, keeping the kids fed and clothed, offering them as normal a life as she could. But something dark was watching Cabin 28, something that would soon turn Keddie into the site of one of the most brutal, unsolved massacres in American history. On April 11, 1981, Sue Sharp settled in for what seemed like a typical Saturday night. Her oldest son, John, had invited his best friend, Dana Wingate, 17, over for the night. The boys spent the evening in town, hitchhiking around, but eventually made their way back to Cabin 28. Inside the cabin, Sue's younger sons, Rick and Greg, were already in their bunk beds. Their friend, Justin Smart, was sleeping over. Her daughter Tina had been at a neighbor's house watching TV but would return home later. Sue locked the door. The house went silent. And by morning, Ketty would never be the same. On the morning of April 12, 1981, Sheila Sharp pushed open the front door of cabin 28 and froze. The living room was a bloodbath. Her mother, Sue, lay on the floor, bound with electrical tape, her body brutally beaten. Beside her were John Sharp and Dana Wingate, both slaughtered with knives, a hammer, and sheer brutality. Blood spattered the walls. The furniture was overturned. It was absolute carnage. Sheila, paralyzed by terror, stumbled backward, her breath ragged. But then, through the shock, one thought sliced through. Where was Tina? Her 12-year-old sister was missing. In the middle of the massacre, in a house dripping with blood, Tina had been taken. Investigators arrived at cabin 28 to a scene straight out of a nightmare. Sue, John, and Dana were all bound, beaten, and stabbed. Tina was nowhere to be found. The younger boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were unharmed, asleep in the next room. But the most unsettling discovery? There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this had either been let in or had a key. Then came the chilling details. Blood was smeared on the doorknobs, indicating someone had left the cabin covered in it. A butcher knife and a bloody hammer lay nearby, not from the Sharps' home. The phone lines had been cut, making sure no one inside could call for help. The killers weren't finished. They had taken Tina. She was gone without a trace. Sheriff Doug Thomas surveyed the chaos inside cabin 28, trying to make sense of it. The way the bodies were positioned, the sheer overkill in the murders, it felt personal. This wasn't a simple break-in gone wrong. It was targeted, calculated. But why the Sharp family? Sue was a single mother with no enemies. She had moved to Ketty for a fresh start, far from the abusive relationship she had left behind. If she had attracted the wrong kind of attention, no one in town had any idea. And then there was the weapon selection. A knife, a hammer, a second knife taken from the kitchen, and later found bent at a 25-degree angle, as if someone had stabbed with it so violently that the blade itself had broken. The level of rage in this attack went beyond homicide. It was sadistic. And one more thing gnawed at investigators. The younger children, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, had been left alive. At first, Justin Smart, just 12 years old, insisted he had slept through the entire massacre. But as days passed, his story changed. Under hypnosis, a controversial technique at the time, Justin revealed a bizarre and horrifying account. He claimed he woke up in the middle of the night and saw Sue Sharp being attacked by two men in the living room. One had dark hair and wore glasses. The other was younger, clean-shaven. In his fragmented memory, he saw John and Dana come home, only to be jumped and beaten. One of the men had a knife. The other had a hammer. And then, in the shadows, he saw Tina. According to Justin, she was taken out the back door, her muffled screams swallowed by the trees. Investigators were desperate for leads, and their attention soon turned to cabin 26, just feet away from the crime scene. Living there was Martin Smart, Justin's own stepfather. And what they found was disturbing. Martin was violent, short-tempered, and unpredictable. His wife, Marilyn, had been terrified of him, and she soon told police that, on the night of the murders, he had burned something in their fireplace. What it was, she couldn't say. But what really made detectives uneasy? Martin's best friend, a man named Bob Deed, had been staying with him at the time of the murders. Bo was an ex-con with ties to organized crime, and he bore an uncanny resemblance to the dark-haired man with glasses Justin had described under hypnosis. Detectives questioned Martin Smart. He was evasive, defensive, but there was no solid evidence to tie him to the crime. Then months later, an investigator discovered something chilling. In the case file, a handwritten note had been logged and then seemingly forgotten. It was from Martin Smart himself, a letter addressed to Marilyn, his estranged wife. It read, "I've paid the price for your love, and now that I've gotten rid of them, you have to love me back." A confession or a twisted manipulation? Either way, authorities never arrested Martin Smart. And meanwhile, Tina Sharp was still missing. 3 years passed. The Sharp family tried to move forward, though the wounds never truly healed. Then, on April 22, 1984, a bottle collector walking through the remote woods of Butte County, nearly 50 miles from Keddie, stumbled upon something that turned his blood cold: a human skull. Nearby, he found a child's jacket, a pair of jeans with a missing back pocket, a medical tape dispenser. Investigators arrived, hoping the remains belonged to a random missing person case. But then a forensic dental match confirmed the worst. The skull belonged to Tina Sharp. She had been kidnapped, taken deep into the wilderness, and left to rot. Her body had decayed past recognition. Any evidence that could have revealed what happened to her, how she died, or who took her, was long gone. The killer had won. Story 9, The Gainesville Ripper. On the 24th of August 1990, the quiet city of Gainesville, Florida, awoke to something unnatural. Inside an apartment near the University of Florida, 2 young women lay dead. One in her bed, the other posed in a way that sent a clear message. The next day, another body was found. Then another. Then another. By the time the bloodshed ended, 5 students had been slaughtered. The killings were fast, brutal, and disturbingly ritualistic. Gainesville had been gripped by something far worse than random violence. This was the work of a predator who thrived on fear. And the man responsible had been honing his craft long before he ever stepped foot in Florida. Danny Rolling was born in 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana, to a man who should have protected him but instead beat the innocence out of him before he ever had a chance to keep it. His father, James Rolling, was a police officer who ruled his home like a dictator. He despised Danny, calling him worthless, weak, and a mistake. His mother tried to leave but always came back, allowing the cycle of abuse to continue. By the time Danny was 5, he had already felt the full force of his father's rage. By 15, he had begun to watch women through their windows, fantasizing about the control he would one day take for himself. And by adulthood, the rage inside him had become unstoppable. He drifted through life without direction, joining the military, but failing to keep his discipline, turning to petty crimes and theft to survive. One night, after an argument, he grabbed a gun and shot his father in the stomach and the head. The man survived, but Danny didn't stay to see the outcome. He ran, and he never looked back. Danny lived like a phantom, drifting from state to state, leaving behind small but significant crimes, burglaries, assaults, and disturbing acts of voyeurism. Then, in November 1989, his fantasies turned into reality. A family in Shreveport, Louisiana was found murdered in their home. The father was killed instantly. The daughter, Julie Grissom, was attacked, violated, and posed in a disturbingly familiar way. Her body arranged after death, as if Danny was perfecting his method. The murder didn't bring him satisfaction. It only made him hungrier. By mid-1990, Danny had made his way to Florida. He camped in the woods, stealing supplies and watching from the darkness. He studied the students, their routines, their weaknesses. Then, in the dead of night on August 24th, he chose his first victims. He entered an apartment where Christina Powell and Sonia Larson slept. Sonia was the first to die, attacked silently in her bed. She barely had time to react before his knife cut through her flesh, ending her life in seconds. Then he turned his attention to Christina. He took his time with her, and when he was done, he posed her body, covering her with a towel as if she were part of some sick ritual. The next day, he struck again. Krista Hoyt, an 18-year-old student, failed to show up for work. When police entered her apartment, they found horror beyond words. She had been killed with the same brutality, but this time, Danny left behind a signature that would haunt even the most hardened investigators. He had severed her head and placed it on a bookshelf, facing the door, waiting to be seen. Panic took over Gainesville, but Danny wasn't done yet. On August 27th, he broke into the home of Tracy Pauls and Manuel Manny Taboada. Manny, a former football player, fought back, but Danny had experience. He overpowered Manny, stabbing him dozens of times before moving on to Tracy. When he finished, he left her lifeless and posed, like the others. Then, he vanished into the night. Gainesville shut down. Students fled, terrified of who would be next. Gun stores sold out of ammunition, and residents slept with knives under their pillows. Police worked around the clock, but they had no leads, no suspects, and no pattern beyond the gruesome signature left behind. Danny Rolling had left no trace of himself, or so he thought, because within days, a single mistake would put him right in the crosshairs of investigators, and the hunter was about to become the hunted. The bodies had been found. The city of Gainesville was frozen in terror, waiting for the next attack, knowing that whoever had done this was still out there, watching, waiting. Police worked around the clock, but the killer left no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. Whoever he was, he moved like a ghost, striking with precision, vanishing without a trace. But ghosts make mistakes, and Danny Rolling was about to make his, long before Gainesville. Danny Rolling was a man on the run. After shooting his father and leaving Louisiana behind, he drifted across the country, robbing homes, stealing cars, and breaking into convenience stores. It was in one of those small robberies that his luck finally ran out. A few days after the last Gainesville murder, Rolling was arrested in Ocala, Florida. Not for the killings, but for robbing the supermarket at gunpoint. He had no idea that his arrest would eventually lead straight back to Gainesville. For weeks, police had been grasping at nothing, chasing rumors, dead ends, and false suspects. Then, they found the campsite. Deep in the wooded areas outside Gainesville, officers stumbled upon a small, hidden makeshift camp. A tent, a few supplies, and something much more alarming. Clothing matching fibers found at the crime scene's audio tapes recorded by the killer. Himself a screwdriver and tools linked to the home break-ins Danny Rolling had left behind his own confession, disguised in music and rambling messages. He spoke of pain, of rage, of needing control. And he described something else. Investigators now had a new name to work with, Danny Rolling, but there was no direct evidence tying him to the crimes. Then, something unexpected happened. Shreveport police contacted Gainesville authorities. A detective from Louisiana had been following the Florida case and saw frightening similarities to a cold case in his own city. The 1989 murders of the Grissom family. He told Gainesville detectives about a local suspect they had questioned but never charged. A drifter, a man with a violent past. His name was Danny Rolling. The moment the connection was made, Gainesville police knew they had their man. But knowing wasn't enough. They needed proof. And that proof was already sitting in a police evidence locker. When Rolling was arrested for the armed robbery in Ocala, police had taken a routine DNA sample. They never imagined it would solve one of the most horrifying murder sprees in Florida history. When the results came back, it was undeniable. The blood, semen, and hair found at the Gainesville crime scenes. They all belonged to Danny Rolling. The Gainesville Ripper had been caught. Danny Rolling was officially charged with the murders of Christina Powell, Sonia Larson, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manuel Taboada. But before the trial could even begin, Rolling did something unexpected. He confessed. Not only to Gainesville, but to Shreveport as well. In cold, emotionless detail, he recounted how he stalked his victims, how he crept into their homes, and how he made sure to leave his signature behind. His motive, control. It was never about who they were. It was about what they meant to him. Power, dominance, the thrill of being the predator. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. And in 1994, Danny Rolling was sentenced to death, but the victims' families would have to wait another 12 years to see that sentence carried out. For over a decade, Rolling sat on death row, giving interviews, writing songs, even getting engaged to a true crime writer. But there would be no escaping justice. On October 25th, 2006, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection. His final words, a gospel song sung softly in his last moments. And then he was gone. But the fear he created, the legacy of terror he left behind, would never truly die. Story 10. The origin of the bystander effect. On the 13th of March, 1964, a scream shattered the early morning silence of Kew Gardens, Queens. A woman was running, stumbling under the dim glow of streetlights, her breath ragged, her voice desperate. A man caught up to her, a glint of steel in his hand. She fought. She screamed. Windows lit up. Shadows moved behind curtains, but no one came outside. No one stopped him. The attack continued until the man walked away into the night, leaving the woman bleeding on the pavement. Minutes passed. Then the man returned. This time, he made sure she wouldn't get up again. By the time Catherine Kitty Genovese took her last breath, she had been stabbed multiple times, and the city would never forget what happened that night. Not just because of the murder, but because of what it revealed about the people who watched it happen. Before she became a tragic headline, Kitty Genovese was full of life. Born in Brooklyn in 1935, she was the eldest of 5 children in a close-knit Italian-American family. Her parents wanted a safer life for their children, and eventually moved to Connecticut. But Kitty stayed behind. New York called to her. The energy, the independence, the possibility. She settled in Queens, working as a bartender and later as a manager at Eve's 11th Hour, a popular local bar. She was charming, quick-witted, and ambitious. Customers loved her, friends adored her. By 1964, she had built a life she loved. She had a steady job, a cozy apartment, and a deeply personal secret. She was in love with a woman named Marianne Zelonko, in an era where being openly gay could mean discrimination, violence, or worse. Kitty and Marianne kept their relationship private. They shared a modest apartment in Kew Gardens, an area known for its quiet streets and strong community. Kitty believed it was a safe place to live. She had no way of knowing that. In the early hours of March 13, her screams would echo through those streets, and no one would come to her rescue. The man who ended Kitty's life was Winston Mosley, a name that would soon become infamous. On the surface, Mosley was unremarkable. A 29-year-old married father of 2, working as a business machine operator. But beneath his quiet demeanor, he harbored dark fantasies. He had already committed multiple violent attacks, sneaking into homes, assaulting women, and taking lives without remorse. He wanted control, and he wanted to kill. That night, he drove through Queens, searching for a victim. Then he saw her. Kitty Genovese had just finished her shift at the bar. She parked her red Fiat and walked toward her apartment. She didn't notice the car idling nearby. She didn't hear the soft click of a door opening. Mosley followed. Kitty Genovese lay on the cold pavement, her body fighting to survive as her breath grew increasingly shallow. The knife had cut deep, slashing through her back, her skin and muscles torn open as blood pooled beneath her. Yet, despite the severity of the attack, she wasn't dead. Not yet. There was still a flicker of life in her, a spark of hope. But that hope was quickly fading, and she had no idea that the worst was yet to come. She tried to move, but the weight of the pain made it difficult. Her body was growing weaker by the second, and she could feel the cold creep through her as she lay there, fighting for every breath. All the while, the killer, Winston Mosley, had already made his first strike. and then walked away, leaving her to bleed out on the street. Kitty's screams had echoed through the night, but as she stumbled toward a nearby storefront, she couldn't have known that the world around her had already turned a deaf ear. From behind windows, lights flickered on and off. Shadows shifted behind closed curtains, but no one dared to step outside. The city of Kew Gardens had become a silent witness to her suffering, and Kitty, despite her agony, was left alone. After Mosley attacked her the first time, something unexpected happened. A man from one of the apartments above heard her cries. He called out from his window, shouting at the attacker to leave her alone. It was a brief interruption in the violence, a moment of hope for Kitty. For a few seconds, Mosley hesitated. He pulled back and walked away, seemingly retreating into the darkness. Kitty, battered and bleeding, managed to gather what strength she had left. She made her way to the nearby apartment building, dragging herself down an alleyway, seeking shelter and hoping for a chance to survive. But that was where the hope ended. Minutes passed, but no one came to her aid. The sound of Kitty's cries slowly faded, and in the quiet of the neighborhood, the killer had time to regroup. Mosley, now confident that he had gone unnoticed, returned to the scene. He found Kitty once again, and this time, there was no one to stop him. This was the second attack, and it was far more brutal than the first. With no one intervening, Mosley went to work with a deadly calm. Kitty was already on the ground, weakened and struggling to stay conscious, but he showed no mercy. He stabbed her repeatedly, making sure she wouldn't rise again. The violence wasn't just about killing her. It was about control, about claiming her life without fear of being caught. And just like the first time, when he had finished, Mosley stood up, wiped his knife clean, and walked away as though the killing meant nothing. Kitty's blood soaked the street, a tragic reminder of the life that was lost. And yet, even in her final moments, no one came to her aid. The myth that would follow Kitty's murder would shape public perception of the crime for decades. Newspapers would later report that 38 people had witnessed the attack. 38 people who had heard her screams, seen the violence unfold, and done nothing. While the exact number of bystanders is now a subject of debate, what was undeniable was that there were people who knew something was happening, people who could have helped, yet they chose to stay silent. Some witnesses were too afraid to act, unsure of what to do. Some assumed that the noise was just a domestic dispute or a fight that didn't require intervention. Others believed someone else would make the call. After all, someone had to have heard the cries, right? The tragedy, however, wasn't just in the brutal murder of Kitty Genovese. It was in the chilling truth that her death occurred because people simply didn't respond. The bystanders who watched, the neighbors who listened, and the strangers who did nothing would go down in history for their inaction. A powerful and disturbing example of human indifference in the face of horror. The case became a symbol, not only of the evil of one man, but also of the failure of a community to take responsibility for the life of another. The legacy of Kitty Genovese's death would later inspire research into the so-called bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any one person is to intervene. Kitty Genovese, in her final moments, would unknowingly embody this dark reality, and her death would bring about a widespread discussion about how society reacts, or fails to react, when confronted with violence. Story 11. The Amy Mihaljevic Case. On the crisp autumn afternoon of October 27, 1989, 10-year-old Amy Mihaljevic stepped off the school bus and waved goodbye to her friends. She made the familiar walk to the nearby shopping plaza, where she often went to the store after school. But that day, Amy would never make it home. She vanished without a trace. Amy's mother, Margaret Mihaljevic, was waiting at home, expecting to see her daughter walk through the door any minute. The hours passed, and as the night grew darker, Margaret's concern turned into panic. Her daughter hadn't called, and she hadn't come home. The uneasy silence in the house only worsened the longer Amy was missing. Margaret immediately contacted the police, setting off a search that would span years. Amy's disappearance was a mystery that would grip the small community of Bay Village, Ohio, a quiet suburban town where kidnappings and violent crimes were almost unheard of. What made Amy's case even more chilling was the fact that she had been approached by someone who seemed to know exactly how to lure her in. Witnesses reported seeing a man speaking to Amy in the plaza shortly before she was taken. According to their accounts, the man had appeared calm and confident, and he had spoken to Amy as though he were someone she knew well. Some later speculated that he may have been using the pretense of a job offer or some kind of favor to lure the young girl away. But no one knew for sure. The mystery surrounding the man's identity would remain unsolved for years. The authorities immediately launched a massive search effort for Amy, combing through local neighborhoods, the surrounding woods, and nearby areas where she might have wandered off. Flyers were posted everywhere with Amy's picture and a description of the man she had been seen with. Yet, despite their best efforts, there were no solid leads. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Amy's disappearance began to take on a haunting quality. There was no physical evidence, no signs of a struggle, and no clues as to where she could be. But the case didn't fade from public attention. In fact, it only grew in its mystery, with the entire community of Bay Village haunted by the question: who could have taken this sweet, innocent child? And why? As the days turned into weeks, and weeks, and weeks, into months, the search for Amy Mihaljevic became an ongoing investigation with little progress. The police worked tirelessly to find the missing girl, but there were simply no solid leads. The town was in a state of collective anxiety. People locked their doors, families kept their children close, and whispers of fear rippled through the tight-knit community. Detectives from the Bay Village Police Department worked with FBI agents and other law enforcement agencies to piece together the few clues they had. Amy had been taken during the early afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., which gave investigators a small window of time to track down witnesses and leads. However, despite interviews with people who had seen Amy at the plaza, no one could identify the man who had approached her. The description was vague: a white male, between 30 and 40 years old, with dark hair and a medium build. Some witnesses thought he was wearing a baseball cap, but the details were unclear. The investigation focused on the possibility that the man had been a local resident, someone who knew the area well. Police scoured the neighborhood for any signs that might indicate a connection to Amy's abduction. Theories were proposed, and suspects were questioned, but none of the leads ever turned into something concrete. The case took a strange turn in the months following Amy's disappearance. Several potential sightings of her were reported, but each one led to a dead end. There were claims that a girl matching Amy's description had been seen in different cities, and some people even reported receiving strange phone calls in the weeks after her disappearance. But, as time went on, the case grew colder. The public's attention started to fade. Amy's story began to slip from the headlines, and the investigation was increasingly seen as a cold case. Still, there were some who refused to let go of the mystery. It wasn't until almost 5 months later that the case would take a dramatic turn. On February 8, 1990, nearly 5 months after Amy vanished, a hunter walking through a rural area in rural Sandusky County, Ohio, came across a shocking discovery: the body of a young girl found in a field. The girl had been dumped in a secluded area, miles away from Bay Village. At first, investigators feared the worst, and when Amy's body was positively identified, it confirmed their worst suspicions. The young girl who had vanished from the plaza was gone forever. Amy Mihaljevic had been murdered. Her body was found with signs of a struggle, and the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. But even in her death, the mystery remained. There were no obvious clues to the identity of her killer, and there was still no sign of the man who had lured her away from the plaza months before. Investigators were left to piece together the few clues they had, trying to understand what had led to this brutal, senseless crime. The discovery of Amy's body reopened the investigation into her murder, and authorities launched a renewed effort to find the killer. But despite the new focus, the case would remain unsolved for many years. With the discovery of Amy Mihaljevich's body, the investigation into her murder reignited. But the case would prove to be far from straightforward. While the small town of Bay Village was rocked by the news of Amy's death, it was clear that her killer remained elusive. Despite the intensity of the search, the police had no solid leads. They couldn't find any DNA evidence that might point to the identity of the murderer. The lack of witnesses or clear evidence left the investigators grappling with their most difficult question. Who could have done this? And why? As the case dragged on, several theories emerged, each one as unsettling as the last. With no suspects, the community was left with a growing list of possibilities, none of which brought them any closer to the truth. One theory that initially caught the attention of investigators was that the abduction and murder had been the work of a serial offender. The way the crime had unfolded, Amy being lured away from a public place, the brutal nature of her death, and the fact that she had been taken at random, matched the profile of other similar crimes across the United States. The police began looking into whether Amy's murder was connected to other unsolved cases. They examined the records of other abductions and killings, hoping to identify patterns that might lead them to a potential suspect. But despite the investigation, no other similar cases could be conclusively linked to Amy's. Another theory that emerged focused on the idea of a local connection. Investigators initially believed that Amy's killer might have been someone from the immediate area. Someone familiar with the town and the routine of children in the neighborhood. Given how quiet and close-knit the town of Bay Village was, the thought that a stranger had come into the area to commit such a crime seemed increasingly unlikely. Theories about a potential local suspect began to emerge, with many speculating that someone familiar with the shopping plaza where Amy had been abducted might have been involved. However, despite interviews with residents and thorough investigations, no solid evidence ever pointed to a local suspect. As the years passed, the investigation stalled, and the case became what many referred to as a cold case. Despite years of interviews, dozens of leads, and the efforts of the police, the killer's identity remained a mystery. It was a bitter pill to swallow for Amy's family, particularly her mother, Margaret, who refused to give up hope that her daughter's killer would one day be caught. For years, the case remained largely unsolved, but then, in 2001, a breakthrough occurred. In the early 2000s, investigators began to focus on a man named James Renner, a freelance journalist who had been covering the case. Renner, who had been fascinated by the case from the beginning, decided to take matters into his own hands. He started investigating the case with a fresh perspective and unearthed some important leads that had been overlooked in earlier investigations. Renner began speaking with people who had been close to Amy's case, including those who had lived in the Bay Village area at the time of her disappearance. It was during this period that Renner became aware of a new suspect, a man named Dennis H. McGuire, a convicted child molester who had lived in the area at the time of Amy's murder. McGuire had been in and out of prison for various offenses, and his name had surfaced during earlier investigations. However, it had not been pursued with the same intensity as other potential leads. Renner's research led to the revelation that McGuire had, in fact, been in the vicinity of the shopping plaza where Amy was abducted on the day she disappeared. This connection reignited the investigation and led to the renewed scrutiny of McGuire's background. Investigators also found that McGuire had been known to frequent areas where children gathered, making him a potential suspect in Amy's abduction and murder. Despite these developments, there was still no concrete evidence to link McGuire to Amy's death, and he denied any involvement. The case continued to hang in the balance, with many wondering if they would ever see justice for the young girl who had been taken too soon. As the years continued to pass without a resolution, the story of Amy Mihaljevich's murder faded into the background for many. But for her family and the dedicated investigators, the case was never far from their minds. Amy's mother, Margaret, was determined to keep the memory of her daughter alive, constantly seeking justice for her child. As a mother, the pain of losing Amy in such a brutal, senseless way never truly subsided. She held on to the hope that one day, the truth would come to light, and the person responsible for her daughter's death would be held accountable. It wasn't in 2018, nearly 30 years after Amy's death, that the case finally took an unexpected turn. New forensic technologies, specifically DNA analysis, had advanced significantly in recent years. In the case of cold cases like Immerse, these new tools had the potential to shed new light on long-forgotten evidence. After decades of little progress, investigators turned their attention back to the evidence collected at the crime scene, hoping that modern forensic techniques might reveal something that had been overlooked in the past. DNA samples that had been collected from Amy's clothing and the crime scene were re-examined, and for the first time, investigators found a promising lead. The analysis revealed DNA from an individual who had not been previously identified. The new DNA evidence led investigators to Terry J. McGuire, a man who had been a suspect in the case for years but had never been definitively linked to the crime. The DNA match was a crucial piece of the puzzle, and the long-sought suspect was finally identified. However, the investigation didn't stop there. In addition to the DNA evidence, investigators began looking into McGuire's background more closely. They uncovered a pattern of behavior that seemed to fit the profile of a potential killer. He had a history of violent crimes, including child sexual assault. McGuire's criminal record was filled with disturbing incidents that had previously been overlooked. But the revelation of his DNA connection to Amy's case was the missing piece of the puzzle. The breakthrough brought renewed hope for justice for Amy, but it was also a painful reminder of how long it had taken for the truth to emerge. Investigators now had to move quickly, working to build a solid case that would ensure McGuire's arrest and prosecution. However, despite the significant progress, many questions remained unanswered. Why had McGuire waited so long to act? Why had he taken Amy when she was only 10 years old? And what drove him to commit such a horrific crime? In the wake of the breakthrough, public attention was once again drawn to the case. The media began reporting on the latest developments, and the story of Amy Mihaljevic's tragic death was brought back to the forefront. As details about McGuire's background came to light, the public became more aware of the disturbing nature of the crime and the fact that it had taken so long to bring the perpetrator to justice. Yet, even as justice seemed within reach, there was still the heart-wrenching reality that Amy would never return. Her family had endured 3 decades of grief and heartache, hoping and waiting for answers that seemed to elude them at every turn. The emotional toll on her loved ones was profound, and it was a pain that could never be fully healed, no matter the outcome of the investigation. In 2021, after years of uncertainty, Terry J. McGuire was finally arrested and charged with the abduction and murder of Amy Mihaljevic. The breakthrough in DNA evidence had finally provided the piece of the puzzle that had eluded investigators for so long. As McGuire faced trial, the family of Amy Mihaljevic was left to reflect on the long, painful journey they had endured to see justice done. While Amy's family could never fully heal from the trauma of losing their beloved daughter, they found some measure of comfort in the fact that McGuire had finally been held accountable for his actions. Story 12. The Golden State Killer. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, California was plagued by a series of chilling, violent crimes that gripped the state in fear. A masked intruder crept into homes, attacked couples, and left victims with a sense of terror that would linger for years. For over a decade, the identity of the person responsible for these heinous acts remained a mystery, and the name, the Golden State Killer, became synonymous with one of the most terrifying periods in California's criminal history. But no one could have predicted that the man behind this reign of terror was living in plain sight. The first known attack occurred in 1976, when the killer, later identified as Joseph James D'Angelo, began his spree of burglaries, assaults, and murders in Sacramento County, California. Initially, he was thought to be a mere burglar, stealing valuables from homes. But as the months went on, his crimes escalated. He began to break into homes at night, wearing a mask and threatening couples with firearms. His pattern was horrifying. He would bind the women, tie them up, and place them face down on their beds, often forcing the men to watch as he assaulted their partners. The killer was extremely calculated, taking his time with each crime. In many cases, he would threaten his victims with the possibility of death, but he often left the homes without causing fatalities. The terror escalated further in 1979, when D'Angelo began to murder his victims. His first known victim was Brian and Katie Maggiore, a young couple who had been walking their dog late at night in Rancho Cordova, a suburb of Sacramento. The killer shot them both, leaving their bodies in a quiet neighborhood. This marked the beginning of a murderous phase that would continue to haunt California. His attacks spanned across multiple cities, from Sacramento to the Bay Area, and then further south into Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. His ability to evade capture became legendary. The killer became known by several names over the years: the original Night Stalker, the East Area Rapist, and the Golden State Killer. Each name symbolized a different phase of his horrific reign of terror, but it was clear that the same individual was behind it all. What made his crime so difficult to solve was his ability to stay under the radar. He wore a ski mask or other disguises during his attacks, and his footprints were often the only physical evidence left behind. Despite a multitude of witness reports, sketches, and DNA samples collected from crime scenes, the killer was never caught. As the years passed, the Golden State Killer's attacks grew more brazen and increasingly violent. He continued to evade law enforcement, and his pattern of crime was so elusive that he quickly became one of the most notorious unsolved serial killers in history. The police struggled to find any substantial leads that could link the attacks together, and many people feared that this predator might never be caught. The escalation of his crimes was terrifying. In addition to burglaries and sexual assaults, the Golden State Killer began murdering his victims without hesitation. His ruthless precision was apparent in how he carried out his crimes, making him one of the most calculated criminals in the country. He had an uncanny ability to stalk and plan his attacks, often selecting couples in suburban neighborhoods where there would be fewer witnesses and where he could act in complete darkness. In 1986, after a series of brutal murders, the Golden State Killer's attack seemed to stop suddenly. There was no explanation for the abrupt pause in his crimes, but for many, the fear didn't dissipate. Investigators continued to work tirelessly, revisiting crime scenes, studying DNA evidence, and chasing down countless leads. But there were no major breakthroughs. With each passing year, the case grew colder. By the 1990s, the investigation into the Golden State Killer had largely stalled. The police had no new information, and with no identifiable suspects, the case was eventually classified as a cold case. The world moved on, but the mystery of the Golden State Killer remained one of the darkest chapters in the history of criminal investigations. However, as technology advanced, so too did law enforcement's ability to investigate unsolved crimes. The rise of genetic genealogy, the use of public DNA databases to solve cold cases, would provide the breakthrough the world had been waiting for. In 2018, DNA evidence from the Golden State Killer's crime scenes was uploaded to a public genealogy website, GeneMatch, in the hopes that it might lead to a distant relative of the killer. This new technique was revolutionary, allowing investigators to use familial DNA to trace potential suspects. Within days, an unlikely match was found. A distant relative of the killer had uploaded their DNA, and investigators were able to trace it back to a man living in Exeter, California. That man was Joseph James D'Angelo, a retired police officer who had worked in various law enforcement positions throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The discovery was a stunning twist, as D'Angelo's position in law enforcement had provided him with the perfect cover for his crimes. As an officer, he had access to police resources and knew exactly how to avoid detection. For decades, D'Angelo had slipped through the cracks, using his knowledge of the system to stay one step ahead. When investigators finally tracked D'Angelo down, they obtained a sample of his DNA and matched it to the evidence left at multiple crime scenes. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested and charged with 8 counts of murder and 50 counts of rape. The long-awaited arrest brought a sense of justice and relief to the families of his victims and to the millions of people who had followed the case for decades. As D'Angelo was arrested, the sheer magnitude of his crimes became more apparent. He was eventually linked to 13 murders, 50 sexual assaults, and hundreds of burglaries. The Golden State Killer had evaded justice for over 4 decades, but finally, the man behind the terror was exposed. When Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in 2018, it marked the beginning of the end of a decades-long manhunt for the notorious Golden State Killer. His capture was not just a victory for the authorities, but for the countless victims and their families who had suffered in silence, waiting for justice. The case had remained one of the most infamous and frustrating unsolved mysteries in criminal history. But finally, the truth had been uncovered. As DeAngelo faced the justice system, the scope of his crimes was slowly revealed to the public. The trial was a lengthy and complex process, with many of the victims and their families hoping that, after more than 40 years, they would finally get the closure they had longed for. The horror of DeAngelo's crimes was undeniable, but the pain of his victims was even more evident. Those who had been affected by his violent reign of terror were forced to relive the trauma of the attacks and the devastation that had rippled through their lives. Despite his capture, the final moments of DeAngelo's trial were filled with tension. He entered a guilty plea in June 2020, admitting to 13 murders, 13 rapes, and a range of other crimes, including burglary and kidnapping. In a sentencing hearing, victims and their families were allowed to address him directly, sharing their anger, heartbreak, and sense of betrayal. The hearing was a cathartic moment for many who had spent years wondering whether they would ever see the man who had terrorized them face justice. DeAngelo was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a bittersweet moment of finality for the families of the victims. They had spent decades trying to find peace, and now, with the conviction, they were left to reconcile the damage that had been done. While justice had been served, the wounds inflicted by DeAngelo's crimes would never fully heal.